This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio. It's episode 749. This week we welcome Dr. Delphine Farmer from Colorado State University. We're going to talk about the current science on wildfires, talk a little bit about sampling, a lot about cleaning. And before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can continue doing the show. IAQ Radio Association sponsors are IICRC, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification at iicrc.org. The Restoration Industry Association, RIA, at restorationindustry.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA, at eia-usa.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are Particles Plus at particlesplus.com, BioPlanet at byoplanet.com, Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick at cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to Bob Spielvogel in Brookline, Massachusetts, who was first to identify 1956 is the year that John McCarthy coined the term artificial intelligence. Here's today's IAQ Radio Trivia question. What term is used to refer to a type of fire that rapidly spreads through the upper canopy of trees and is often propelled by wind? Back to you, Joe.
All right. Delphine Farmer is a professor in the Department of Chemistry at Colorado State University. Her research focuses on understanding the air we breathe, both indoors and out, and how the chemistry of air impacts human health, ecosystems, and climate. Her recent work is focused on wildfire smoke, starting with aircraft projects flying in large wildfire plumes, and more recently looking at how smoke interacts with building surfaces. Welcome back, Delphine. Dr. Farmer, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
I can't believe it's been almost 4 years. I'm in shock how time flies when you're having fun, huh?
Absolutely.
Although the last 4 have been a little rough. We've been a little inside too much. But anyway, hey, let's talk about this. We had you back a while back, and you were talking to us about indoor versus outdoor air chemistry. And then you kind of combined your outdoor air expertise with work on indoor air, and kind of set you up well to do research and discuss wildfires and their impact on environmental quality. Tell our audience a little bit, if you would, about your background, how local events in Colorado all kind of led to your current work on wildfire smoke issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background was originally I was an atmospheric chemist, so studying outdoor air quality and air pollution and the chemistry of what happens when you have emissions from cars and you have emissions from industry and they interact with forests and really change the air that we breathe. So that's the background of what I came from. And of course, among the major pollution sources is wildfire smoke. So we've been thinking about that for quite a few years, as not only as an atmospheric chemistry community, but also my research group has been thinking about what is in wildfire smoke and how it changes as it transports. And so back in 2018, we were part of a large study where we were had all our fancy mass spectrometers and other instruments on a plane, and we flew into wildfire plumes in the western United States and in the summer of 2018 and tried to understand what that chemistry was and what was in there. And at the same time, I was involved in the home chem study where we were thinking about just how everyday activities started impacting indoor air, so cooking and cleaning. And those two pieces felt a little separate until a couple of years ago. And in December of 2021, there was, right at the end of the year, there was this terrible event here in Colorado where we had the Marshall Fire. And so this high winds just whipped a fire through communities here in the Front Range near Boulder, and really damaged a lot of homes. And, you know, I had friends who were living in homes that weren't burnt down, but that were really beginning to get affected. And so they wanted to know what they should be doing about the smoke that had gotten into their homes. And my gut reaction was like, oh, well, we must have a whole lot of scientific literature. There's got to be a lot of evidence as to what you should be able to do. And what was really interesting to me is that there's not been a lot of scientific studies about what to do. There's a lot of advice out there, but it's not grounded in research. And so that's what really spurred me to start thinking about this problem. So we had a project in spring of 22 where we were going out to NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology in Maryland, and they have this amazing test house. And we were going to do another sort of home chem-like project where we were going to have a large number of people thinking about the chemistry. And so I really pushed because I wanted to see what happened when wildfire smoke got into homes. So that's really the sort of story of how I got into the subject, and how, you know, it's really come out of not just my scientific interests, but because I really want to have good information to give to my friends and family.
You know, I want to get to that NIST study in a moment, but I wanted to go back through. I looked at Cliff's blog from the last show we did, and some of the key points that I kind of stood out to me were that as a researcher of outdoor air, you find that high levels of some indoor air pollutants actually required your instruments to be recalibrated. That's how high the pollutants are in indoor air.
Absolutely.
The key was outdoor sunlight drives chemical reactions, and there's too little sunlight indoors to cause these reactions. Surface area, outdoors is much larger than indoors. The outdoors has much less surface area than the indoors. And there's an absence of wind movement, of course. How did studying the effects of wildfires indoor different from what you studied during home chem? How did, home chem change how you looked at wildfire smoke and vice versa?
Well, I mean, I think actually all of those points really get to the core of what we found, which is that our understanding of how wildfire smoke changes outdoors, like in those big smoke plumes that transport, last summer or 2 summers ago, there were all these wildfires in Canada that were coming down to New York City and down to the East Coast and really affecting people. So all of the chemistry, the atmospheric community has really been studying has been all of that outdoor chemistry where you don't have the surface area, but you do have sunlight driving chemical reactions. And so I keep on talking to scientists who say, well, isn't what's going to happen indoors, isn't that just putting wildfire smoke in a box? What's different about it? But of course, that point that the indoor system is very different from the outdoor system. Again, that high surface area, low levels of light, ventilation is certainly can drive changes in the air very quickly, but there's also the opportunity for pollutants to just sit on surfaces for very long periods of time. And anybody who's walked into a home where there was cigarette smoking, intensively in the past, you can walk in and you can smell that. So you know that things are different indoors from outdoors. And so I think that's really where the connection is that understanding outdoor atmospheric chemistry is very useful in terms of thinking about what kind of smoke your house is going to be exposed to. But then once that smoke gets inside, the processes are quite different. And so I think what we learned from home chem really helped set us up to think about the problem and to think about that indoor air and how it was going to be different.
Cliff, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess, one of the questions was in doing some of these studies, I think that you had done some comparisons, and I think the results were quite surprising. One was, using, different types of air purification equipment and then kind of comparing that to cleaning. And I think one of the things that was most surprising to me was the effect of good cleaning and removing lower levels or lowering the levels of VOCs. But one of the questions I had really about that study and the studies that you've done is these air cleaners that were used, were they just strictly HEPA air cleaners or something like Corsi Rosenthal boxes that would have high Murr filters and so on and so forth, or did they actually have some sort of adsorbent capability, such as, and I mean a significant amount of it, not a filter that's covered with carbon, but I mean a filter that actually would have a pound or more of carbon in it. Did the carbon have any effect, or
Yes.
Go ahead.
So maybe I'll go back a moment before I answer that question and explain just quickly what the experiment is that we did. And then we can talk about how those results impacted and how we thought about air purifiers versus surface cleaning. So a couple of years ago when we were out in Maryland and we were interested, and I was just really curious what happens when wildfire smoke gets indoors. So what we did was have all our instruments, some were inside this house and most were out in the garage pulling that indoor air into the instruments so we could make these really great measurements of the chemistry and particles that were in the air. And so then what we would do would be to add a wildfire smoke proxy. And to do that, we actually just used a very simple cocktail smoker and added ponderosa pine wood chips, so typical fuel for Western United States forest fires. And so then we would add actually a very small amount of smoke into the house, and we would then watch what happened. So we'd see all these particles and all these gases, all the levels would go up quite high when we first added the smoke, and then they would decay away. Some of that, there was obviously some dilution through the house, but then a lot of, and ventilation at the same time. But then we would see all these particles and these gases then just sticking to all of the surfaces, so all that surface area inside the house. And then we could watch over time what then happened and how those gases and particles would then change and respond over hours and days. And then we could play around with perturbations. And so we were able to try out different cleaning techniques and see what happened. So that's the experiment, just in a nutshell. But in terms of then the cleaning, and so we worked on, we did a couple of things. So we tried, well, actually, the first thing we saw in our data was that obviously the levels when you add smoke for all these gases and particles, they go up. Now the particle levels would come back down quite quickly. Through deposition as well as ventilation. And so, within a couple of hours of the addition, the particle levels would be back down to where they were before we added any smoke. The difference was in the gases. And so we would have all of these volatile organic compounds, so VOCs, that we know are associated with wildfire smoke. And those gases, when we started the experiment, they were quite low. Then we would add smoke and they would go up and then they would slowly decay back down, but they would never get back down to their original levels that we had in the house before we added any smoke. Every time we added more smoke, we would have that new background level of those gases go up. And that background level just lasted days, weeks. And I mean, I'll admit, I felt terrible because NIST had very generously offered to host us in this experiment house. And they have this beautiful test house. And here we were permanently damaging their house by adding smoke. And what we thought was actually a pretty small amount of smoke, the exposure that one would have if there was a wildfire event, a little distance away, and then it came towards your house for a few hours. We weren't adding a lot of smoke, but we were permanently changing the chemistry of the air inside the home. But of course, what was happening was that all of these gases were also depositing on the surfaces inside the house. So on floors and the walls, on any fabric, etc. And they were sticking, and then some of them would be diffusing. So you can think of that as permeating into those surfaces. And so that would initially mean that the surfaces were acting like a sink. They were pulling out all of those smoke gases from the air, those smoke VOCs. But then after the first few hours, when the particle levels had dropped and we were pulling clean outdoor air through the ventilation system into the house, all of that organic matter that had now, we couldn't see it, but it had deposited on all of these surfaces, would then slowly move back out to the gas phase. So what we had done was basically create a whole reservoir on all the surfaces of the house of all of these smoke-associated VOCs and gases. So now they could slowly permeate back out from those surfaces back into the air of the home. And so that meant that we had created a source of smoke VOCs and a source that was not going away. So we just had this permanent change, at least for the duration of the experiment, and we predicted certainly for months at least, this permanent background level now of smoke VOCs that anybody going into the house would then be breathing. So that's what the smoke did.
Yeah, go ahead.
Two follow-ups. How was the home ventilated? So did it have an ERV, or did it have what kind of ventilation? And the second question is, did you insert the smoke directly into the house, or did it come from the outside through nooks and crannies into the home like a real wildfire?
Yeah, so we did two things. First off, there was a very controlled mechanical ventilation system. And I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to give you all the acronyms associated with it, but okay. It was an extremely well-controlled ventilation system. It did have quite a low ventilation rate because the reason NIST built this test house was to understand energy efficiency. So they have an extremely efficient house, which we made very inefficient by forcing them to do all sorts of strange things. But what it did was have an extremely controlled air change rate, and then they had SF6 injections every day, and so we could really understand what that air change rate was in the house. And it was and in this case it was quite low. It was about 0.5 per hour. So that was the ventilation rate. Then the way we actually introduced the smoke into the house in two different ways. One was just a direct addition. So we went into the house, we turned on some box fans to make sure we were mixing air, and we would just have this cocktail smoker release a little puff of smoke into the house, and then we would watch all our instruments, all the instruments would all go crazy with what they saw as being a high level, but it wasn't a level that you could see in the house. I will say it wasn't like running a barbecue with a lot of smoking, coming out. It was a pretty small level, but so that was one way we did it. So we would just direct add, and then we would scoot out of the house and then watch what happened. The other way is we actually wanted to simulate aged wildfire smoke. So you could think of it as the difference between a wildfire near your home. So if you were in Los Angeles, in Riverside or Irvine, and that wildfire smoke from the region was coming into your home, that's quite nearby. That's different smoke from if it's wildfires up in Canada and they've transported several days. So we wanted to simulate that. So what we did in that case was we built this big chamber, this big Teflon chamber that we had outside of the house. And then we would add smoke and we would age it in this chamber with ozone. And then we would inject that aged wildfire smoke into the house just by flowing air or by physically, like pushing into that chamber and pushing the air into the home. So we tried both ways. From a chemistry perspective, it doesn't really matter. The wildfire smoke has components. It's got the particles and it's got the gases. And so we could watch how those go in. What we didn't have, and I will say this, is we didn't have a lot of ash. The way we made smoke focused on making those smaller particles that are inhalation hazards, but we didn't make a lot of ash, which is what one does see with these really large wildfires events. So I will note, we were looking at just much lower levels of smoke, but the chemistry is the same. The chemical principles will hold. So we learned a lot about cleaning and about how that smoke behaved.
Okay, one of the things that you had mentioned before really struck a chord with me. I think strikes a chord with restores in general. And you were talking about this baseline, okay, and that how this baseline would increase every time there were certain activities in the house, like you would do your test, and some of it wouldn't go away, some of it would remain there. Yeah, we have many known combustion sources in houses, particularly in the kitchen. People can grill in their kitchens today, and people don't always run their exhaust fans and so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that troubles, and I think it's a big point of contention, I think, in the restoration and in the insurance industry today, is we have no idea what's in the background of a house before this happens. But certainly we know that there are all these combustion sources, and there's all this cooking, and there's all this stuff that went on before, and you can't really effectively draw a line and determine which was which. And really, the question is, and I think one of the good things is I think effective cleaning is going to remove, it doesn't really matter whether it's old or whether it's new. I think if you're doing effective cleaning, it should remove what was more recently deposited, and I think also what was aged as well.
Yeah. So that gets into a couple of things in there. So, I mean, the first question is exactly like, how do you know how much the background changed? And that's really hard when you have the actual real experience. So I have colleagues down at the University of Colorado in Boulder. They went out into homes after the Marshall Fire and they measured what the levels were. But just as you say, it's really hard to then tell what happens if you're comparing those levels to some statistics from some other study in some other location, if you don't have the levels in a house beforehand. So that's where our experiment was actually able to really ask the question of whether or not smoke has a persistent effect, because we were measuring the house before we added any smoke. So we could really see this effect. And so again, that key outcome was that wildfire smoke it can leave a persistent source inside a home if in the absence of any intervention. So that persistent source, and it can last for weeks, we predicted months and potentially even years, is very chemical dependent. So it is all about the molecular properties, so the actual chemistry of each compound you're looking at. So some compounds will clear out quite quickly, others will take a much longer time in the absence of any intervention. But to then get to that cleaning question, there's sort of 2 points. So one is that we have this persistent source. So if you turn on an air cleaner, that air cleaner is only going to be able to impact the air that it is currently working on. It doesn't actually address the source. So it addresses the air, but not this persistent source. So you're only going to be able to clean the air for as long as you have that air cleaner on. So that's one note. The second note is that we found that air cleaners were actually very ineffective for volatile organic compounds. We tried a large variety of them. I'm not going to name any names, but we tried some commercial ones that had HEPA filters. They're very good for particles, which is what they're designed for, but they are not very effective at all for volatile organic compounds. We tried a variety of air cleaners that had different cleaning methods. So some electronic or plasma, that sort of cleaning method. Again, they did absolutely nothing in terms of reducing VOC levels. None of those were effective. Kersey-Rosenthal boxes, amazing for particles. They're fantastic, but they don't work for gases. We did try some absorbents. And so we had a couple of commercial cleaners that had activated charcoal absorbents. And I'll say they were in general not very effective, but we could, when there was a lot of absorbent, we could see a small change in the VOCs with our very sensitive mass spectrometers. We tried a Corsi box with, instead of using MERV filters. I think we used MERV 11 filters. Instead of that, we used the equivalent filters that had activated charcoal on them. So relatively inexpensive, but saying that they should be pulling out VOC. And again, we found that they had a very small effect. So they certainly were taking up some volatile organic compounds from the VOCs, but not the majority of those smoke compounds that we're now emitting from all the surfaces in the house. So might they help a tiny bit? Would it be worth the money? I don't think so. And again, you're not actually getting at the source. The way to get at the source, though, is that physical surface cleaning. So to do that, we swept the house, and then we vacuumed. So vacuuming and sweeping, just a regular commercial, nothing fancy vacuum, and then we mopped all the floors. We mopped with the solution that was recommended by the Red Cross. So it's a commercial, whatever the cheap surface cleaning solution was from the hardware store we went to, plus a little bit of trisodium phosphate. That said, we're pretty sure that the TSP, the trisodium phosphate, wasn't actually the major operator. I think it's any soapy solution, because a lot of those smoke organic compounds, they behave, if either they're water soluble, so they'll go into any form of water, or they're a little oily. So it's just like cleaning your kitchen pans. Any soap is going to help. So we mopped all the floors, and then we wiped all the table surfaces and the horizontal surfaces on the first floor. And the moment we did that, we saw a huge change in the air concentrations. And we saw those indoor air concentrations of smoke VOCs, they decreased. And in contrast to any air cleaner, they didn't just decrease while we were actively cleaning. We went away, we opened all the windows and doors, we came back, and even after we came back and all the windows and doors were closed, and it had been 24 hours later, we now had a new, much lower baseline. So we had actually removed that source that we'd added. So we'd removed that surface layer of a lot of those smoke compounds and physical removal. And now we had actually decreased that source. So we were decreasing what we were, our exposure to those smoke compounds. And the amount that we decreased it by was roughly proportional to the amount of the surface area of the house we'd been able to clean. So obviously we weren't cleaning the walls or the ceilings or the hidden spaces in the mechanical ventilation system or the closets, but just cleaning that sort of fractional cleaning of all of the floors and all of the horizontal surfaces, we were able to make a very large dent. And so what that told us is that if you want to get rid of the source, it's all about the physical surface cleaning and being as thorough as possible with that.
Cliff?
Yeah, it's funny. We were just actually a fire damage standard was just published recently, and I was privileged to have kind of worked on it. And I'm not sure that we use the word cleaning a lot in the standard, but we really use the word source removal a lot in the standard. And I think our thinking has changed as well. Is that we're just the cleaning removes these sources that are emitting in the house. And I was just surprised we know that it removes the residues effectively, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised that it removed the VOCs effectively, because if you're removing where the reservoirs, it shouldn't be surprising. But I just think that in my personal thinking, I didn't think the two were really related, but I found out from your study and that they are. And I think it's important. I think that it's kind of changed the way we look at it from a restoration standpoint.
I think it's important, but I also think it's empowering, because it means that there's actually something that's not hard that people can do to remediate, obviously, wildfire smoke, whether it's been, obviously when you get, burned down and you have layers of ash in a home, that's a different story. we can talk about that later. But these smoke impacted homes, there is something you can do to remediate. So that's, that's really positive, and this can have a very strong effect, and it doesn't have to be fancy. This is just surface cleaning. And I think, take homes that I'll give are that, cleaning as many surfaces as possible, not just wiping them down, but I think a vigorous cleaning with a soapy solution, as many surfaces, but also including the hidden surfaces in a home. Because of course, gases don't care if your closet door was closed. They don't care that you have an attic that you don't use very much. They don't care that you don't look at your ventilation system. But those are all surfaces where the gases can go and deposit. And so I think when you have these extreme events, cleaning not just your floors that are easy to get to, but as many surfaces in the home as possible is really important. The other thing I'll say is that we didn't do fabric studies, but Elliot Gull out at Portland State University, he did some really nice studies of fabric showing that polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, if you want a mouthful, so PAHs that are in wildfire smoke and are known to be quite toxic, those tend to just seep in like anything, and they treat fabrics like they've just got a large surface area. So same as all of these gases stick to the floors, they're going to stick to fabrics. And so those fabrics then, again, exactly that same idea, they'll slowly release all of those compounds back out. So you have this now new exposure source. So what Elliot Gall showed is just like we surface cleaned. If you go and you wash all your fabrics, so your bed sheets, all your clothing, again, that's another way to remove the surface source. And I think that's another really important piece to remember. So it's not just cleaning the hard surfaces in your home, but it's also really important to think about the soft surfaces in your home. And again, it doesn't have to be fancy, but washing clothing, washing all the fabrics. Furniture is going to be much more complicated to clean, but I think in heavily exposed areas, it would be very important. And so I think those are additional pieces to really think about.
Hey, let's go to our halftime. We've got to thank our sponsors. We'll be back with the second half of our interview with Dr. Delphine Farmer. Association sponsors are the Environmental Information Association. EIA's multidisciplinary membership collects, generates, and disseminates information concerning environmental and occupational health hazards in the built environment at eia-usa.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, iicrc.org. The Restoration Industry Association, the oldest and largest nonprofit professional trade association dedicated to providing leadership and promoting best practices through advocacy, standards, and professional qualifications for the restoration industry at restorationindustry.org. Industry sponsors are Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. BioPlanet at byoplanet.com, improving human, animal, and environmental health with electrostatic spray technology and advanced chemistries at byoplanet.com. Tramex Meters, innovation in moisture detection and humidity monitoring systems since 1974 at tramexmeters.com. We're back with Dr. Farmer. I've got a quick follow-up on the study. When they were cleaning, did you have any of the air purifiers running? Because as you're cleaning, obviously, it's going to generate particulate. And I wonder, did the particle levels go? Also, were you monitoring during the cleaning the particles to see how much they went up, and the same with the gases?
We were absolutely monitoring while we were cleaning, and we were not running the air purifiers. We ran air purifiers separately before and after to look at their effects. We didn't see a strong mobilization of particulate matter while we were cleaning, But I think that's really because, and I'm going to just keep emphasizing that, we did not add a very large amount of smoke. We didn't have a very dirty house to begin with. So there wasn't a lot of particulate matter on the ground for us to kick up. So we didn't see a strong signal. That said, I think it's very well established that just moving around, definitely sweeping, but also vacuuming will mobilize. It will just kick up a lot of particles, and those are particles that people can breathe. And so normally when I'm vacuuming my house and it's relatively clean, I don't really worry about those particles. So I'm not going to go wear an N95 mask. But if you're in a situation where there's a huge amount of air pollution and there's been a huge amount of particulate matter, so I would say anyone impacted by the LA fires, for example, in that case, you're looking at a large amount of smoke that's come in. I've seen pictures from people's homes where you can see the ash. And if you can see that, or if your home was just exposed for days and days to very large amounts of particulate matter, really bad air quality indices. So those AQIs being in the hundreds, in that case, you want to be really cautious, because we know that you just walking through the house is going to kick up those particles. So we didn't see it because we were in a very carefully controlled experiment. But in the real world, we know that just moving through a house where there's been a lot of smoke damage, you're just going to kick up those particles, and those are particles that you could then breathe. So I would say, one wants to wear an N95 mask. We actually were wearing N95 masks during all of our indoor studies, more out of concerns for COVID, but it did add that extra layer of protection for our study, because we didn't know what we were going to see. But I think it's really important for people who are cleaning up post wildfire smoke events. If your house had a lot of wildfire smoke anywhere near it, you're going to want to wear an N95 mask while you're moving through this whole cleaning process. And I think once you've done a very complete physical surface clean of your entire home, and you've changed the filters in your HVAC system, and you've got your windows and doors open to pull nice, clean outdoor air in, after you finish that whole cleaning process, then I think you can take off your N95. But that whole process, in a smoke damaged home, I would be wearing that PPE. I'd be wearing that N95 mask.
Were the levels of VOCs high enough that, well, probably not in your study because there was a small amount of smoke, but an N95 is not going to help with the VOCs.
Correct. So again, the other thing I'm going to recommend, and I sort of mentioned this, is that you don't really want to start cleaning while there's still a massive air pollution event going on outside. You should have other things you're worrying about. And you should be running at that point all the air filters and all the air purifiers that you can in your house to just reduce those levels that you're going to be inhaling. But once you've got clean air outside, so those AQIs, all the air monitors are telling you that they're much lower, back to normal levels outdoors, then you can open all the windows and doors. And so, and you can turn on fans and just try to push as much clean air from outside through your home as possible. And that's going to drop your exposure to those smoke VOCs again until you've fully cleaned all of those surfaces. So I think the N95 is really important, whether or not you have your windows or doors open. It's really important to reduce your exposure to particulate matter that you might be kicking up. But the windows being open and you pushing air through, so having all your fans turned on and really trying to move air through your house, what that's going to do is that's going to protect you from those gases, from the smoke VOCs.
And I think maybe you could confirm my thoughts on that. The particles, we're pretty darn sure what kind of health issues they cause. These VOCs at the levels you're finding, maybe not, they'll cause.
That's exactly right. So we know that particles cause all sorts of cardiorespiratory problems. They cause neurological problems. They have long-term health effects, and they are very definitely damaging to people with either compromised immune systems, asthma, or children or the elderly. So particles, we understand their health effects quite well. And smoke particles, wildfire smoke particles, are very definitely toxic. The gases are much more difficult to tie to health effects. Not much is known about them. It's only relatively recently. Again, remember that study I did in 2018 where we were flying into wildfire smoke? We had colleagues at different universities who were also looking at all of these gases. So this knowledge and understanding of what is in wildfire smoke from a gas phase perspective, that's actually quite new. And so we don't have a deep understanding of the health effects. So that's definitely a big issue. So right now, our advice is based on a couple of things. It's based on the fact that we do know that wildfire smoke brings toxic volatile organic compounds into homes. And we do know enough to be able to say that wildfire smoke is, even the gases are most definitely toxic and will impact human health. The exact levels at which they will, we don't know. And so we don't know if that long-term elevated baseline is going to have any impact on human health. We do know it increases your exposure to toxics, but we don't know if there's going to be a health effect from that. So my advice is based off of a precautionary principle, that we don't know if these smoke VOCs are going to impact your health, but we know that they could, and we know that they're toxic. So if it's me, if it was my family, I would most definitely be wanting to reduce that exposure. But you are absolutely right in thinking that it's the particulate matter that we know about.
Cliff, let me turn it over to you. I want to make sure you get.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think number one is that I think because California is California, and I think maybe because things tend to start there, and I think that there's a lot of independent thought and so on and so forth. I think that there just seems to be what I would consider to be an excessive concern about the hazards of people going back into homes that have not suffered significant damage, and it seems that there's a paralysis, and it just seems that people really should get things going and so on and so forth. And what got me thinking in this direction was a study that most likely you're familiar with. It was done by Arthur Chan at the University of Toronto, and what he did is he measured homes after the Fort McMurray wildfire, and then he went into Toronto and he measured homes, and what he was looking for were arsenic and chromium. And because people, after this Fort McMurray fire, were really worried about it, and they actually found, if I'm not mistaken, equal or higher levels in Toronto where there wasn't a wildfire that they actually found in this wildfire area. And I think it goes back to this baseline discussions that we had before. People have been cooking, people have been cleaning, people have been doing all sorts of stuff, in their homes, and they don't think about it. If they look under their kitchen sink or in their laundry room or in their garage, they have all sorts of hazardous materials that they don't really think about. But, all of a sudden, it's just paralysis by analysis. And then I think in certain situations, money gets into this as well. I think that, there are whole industries that, kind of take advantage of people in these, situations. And, go ahead.
I'm actually going to push back on you a little bit and disagree with you in terms of the fact that exposure, having a home that's been exposed to wildfire smoke, even if you weren't right next to a house that burnt down, what happened in LA can still have very real effects. And there's a study that recently came out from Colleen Reed at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and she was looking at health outcomes, and in particular responses to smoke impacted homes, but not necessarily those homes that had a lot of smoke impact. And what she found was that there were very real impacts. People were still getting nausea and headaches long after the event. And that really did correlate to, a sense of a smell of smoke in homes. You had, if you could smell that smoke, you had more of these outcomes, health outcomes and health effects. So I think one wants to be very careful with saying that there's no danger to houses that have been impacted by smoke, even if it's not a lot. I mean, obviously, if you see ash in your homes or you had large amounts and you have any visible particulate matter or visible smoke damage, that, of course, is going to require cleanup. But I think homes that were exposed to large amounts of smoke, especially in the case of the LA fires, we're talking about days of exposure to very high levels of smoke. Even if you're not necessarily seeing it, that doesn't mean it can't have a real health effect. And again, that's backed up by these studies from Colorado. But I will say, I mean, I think what's important is to not be paralyzed by that concern and to realize that there are very real things that one can do in response to it. And those are, again, if you clean the house and you surface clean the house, and if you don't have layers of smoke in your home, you should be able to just do this yourself. Then you're removing that surface source that could cause that persistent source that could cause health effects. So I think, I think if we're talking about people in Los Angeles, that's a concern. People in other parts of the country, we weren't impacted by those wildfires, and nobody should be, overly concerned, although I would say a clean house is always a good thing. But I think it's important to not just disregard those concerns, because they are real and they are grounded in the science.
No, I think that you misunderstood.
Is a different question.
I think that you misunderstood my point. Okay, what my point was is I saw this this conference. Actually, President Trump went out there, and the mayor of Los Angeles was there as well. And one of the things that the president was saying is, you really need to get after this and kind of get started. And I think the mayor said, no, we need to know exactly, what's in all this residue, that's outside and so on and so forth. And it just seemed that there's some sort of common ground, and I think you should let people do what they feel is necessary, and so on and so forth.
I mean, I think to an extent I'm going to agree with you on one thing and disagree with you on another. I'm going to agree with you that there's no point in waiting. I'm going to disagree with you in terms of just letting people go without appropriate information. Because the thing that's important to realize is that all of that ash and all of that smoke is well established to be really toxic. So I don't think there's a reason to monitor. I'm not a big believer in just monitoring for the case of information when people are trying to get back into their homes. But I do think it's important for the information to be shared with people that this residue is potentially quite toxic, and there's inhalation hazard, there's physical dermal uptake. So people are touching that ash and that smoke. That's a very real exposure mechanism. And what that really means is that people needed to be wearing, and again, I think this is the common ground in between those two perspectives. And I certainly shared my opinion with reporters that the truth is in between. And there's no reason to just wait longer. But there is a reason to only go when you're prepared. So only go when you have appropriate PPE. So an N95 mask to stop your inhalation hazard. Safety goggles to stop things from getting into your eyes. I think it was reasonable for a lot of people to be wearing protective overclothing. So whether that's a bunny suit, or whether that's wearing clothing that then immediately gets tossed into the laundry and does not interact with the rest of your clean clothes. Gloves for sure. But I also think it was really important to make a distinction between people going back to homes and then children or elderly or people with health issues going and interacting with these known toxic components. And so I'm with you that there's definitely a middle ground. There's definitely a common ground. And I think waiting doesn't necessarily make a space any safer. I think that's a problematic assumption. I think waiting for the outdoor air quality to improve, that was a reasonable step. But waiting any longer isn't necessarily going to help. But before people go back into these communities and into these homes that are heavily damaged, then we've got to be talking to people about what are the simple things that they can do in order to make that return safer, to make their cleaning process safer. So I think there's a common ground in there,
You know,
in that space.
from the cleaning standpoint, there really is a science to it, and I think sometimes consumers may not understand. I think sometimes academics may even not necessarily understand it. But you know, if you send somebody to Home Depot, they can buy the right stuff, or they can buy the wrong stuff, or they can get in the middle stuff. And depending on what they do, they can have significant differences with not with spending less money, just knowing what product to use, knowing how to use it. And it's not necessarily using a chemical. When it comes to mops, there are different types of mops, and these miracle microfiber cloths. If you're going to use a cloth, use a microfiber, and whether you're using it dry or whether you're using it wet. I mean, they've been proven to be much more effective in removing the residues. And I think that's the information that homeowners need. Just telling them to clean or telling them to mop. I just think there are dramatic differences, and it just needs to, I think mopping's right, cleaning's right, but I think underneath that, you need a couple more bullet points. Do this, do that, start here, start there, have an orderly way in which you do it. Probably start at the top and work your way down rather than starting at the bottom, working your way up. And there's just, I think, some natural things that you kind of, have evolved over time. And I think that's where a lot of this stuff starts. I'll tell you where, after the Marshall Fire, FEMA put out a pretty good document. I don't know whether you've seen the document that FEMA put out, but I thought it was really, really well done and really simple. And I kind of refer people to that all the time because I think there's just really good, solid information in there.
I mean, I think there is good information out there. I think it is, I absolutely think it's important that it's followed. But I also will say, I think one of the important pieces is thinking about, protecting oneself while one does the cleaning.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really big piece. I think, and yeah, there's a lot of good information out there, from reputable sources. I think the problem is that there's also a lot of information from places where people are, perhaps don't have the best interests of homeowners in mind. And so I think there are a lot of companies, there are some great companies that are really invested in doing a good job of cleaning. And then there are companies that are interested in making a buck and in sharing incorrect information or encouraging people to not use the simpler cleaning approaches, but instead use things like chemical cleaning approaches with ozone or with other sort of oxidants. And I think that's very problematic. So I think these simple approaches are absolutely the right way to go. And again, we can demonstrate and we can prove that they work. But I think one has to be careful about where the information is coming from. But yes, no, I think there's a lot of great information. I think FEMA's provided some really good information. The EPA also has some useful information out there. Or at least had some very useful information out there. So I think there's some really good reputable sources of exactly what to do. And I totally agree with that.
Let me ask you about a kind of contentious issue within the industry, and that is sampling before, after, during these events and the cleaning therein. After listening to you and others, I don't know that sampling should be a common practice on these projects, but I want to get your opinion on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think sampling, because you don't know what happened, you don't know the state of your home before the wildfire event came, it's extremely difficult to interpret the data. And I'm not sure that it should really change what anybody does. And so I think the conservative practice would be to clean your house, or if you have an extremely smoke damaged house, have someone who's professional come in and do it. And again, not just thinking about the obvious surfaces you can see, but the entire home with all of its hidden spaces. I think that's really important. So I think that should happen anyways. I think sampling before, again, what is it going to change? I mean, if the levels are relatively low, maybe you don't clean. So maybe that is useful, or maybe you don't pay someone to clean. So maybe that's helpful for a homeowner. But unless the outcome is truly going to determine your decision-making process, I don't think there's any use to it. I think sampling after a cleaning event, again, the this type of surface cleaning we've been talking about is very effective. I tell people, you're going to want to, clean until the water in your mopping bucket is coming out clear. And you want to be, we're not talking about just a quick job. And I totally agree with the statements about, making sure you're using really high quality materials. But I don't know that the information of what the levels are at the end are also going to be of any use, because what is that going to change about your decisions? Are you going to clean again? Well, if you did a good job in the first place, you shouldn't need to. So I think it might give people some peace of mind, and that could be quite helpful, to say that to only make a measurement after the home has been fully cleaned, fully aired out, everything's been washed, things have been replaced. If someone's very nervous about their home, then having a measurement that says now your home is in the norm for homes in the Western United States, that might be a very reassuring piece of information. But is it scientifically necessary? I don't think so. Not unless people have things like lingering health effects or another external reason. So I think the focus should really be on strong evidence-based cleaning.
All right, we want to thank Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com for sponsoring the roundup. Before we go, Cliff, I want to make sure you get any final questions. And Dr. Farmer, we're really running close to 1 o'clock. Do you have to go anywhere? Can you stay for another minute or two?
I could stay for a few more minutes.
All right, Cliff.
Okay, I think one of the things with the sampling, is if it's kind of like going and having certain medical tests, performed, and you can end up not wanting to have known, what they find, because it's really not going to, you're going to outlive it. This is not going to kill you, but oh my gosh, I have this in my body or whatever. And what can happen is, you have let's say you have it home tested for dioxin. Okay. And we know that there's a lot of dioxin. We know that people have it in their bodies, and we get most of it from ingestion of food and so on and so forth. But, God forbid they have some dioxin testing, and whether there's a fire there or there wasn't a fire there, if it's a house that people have lived in, I'm pretty confident that if you look hard enough and deep enough, we're going to find a little bit of dioxin. And not all dioxins are chemically the same. Some are much less hazardous than others. But all of a sudden, I just think people's, they're going to go on the internet, they're going to research it, and they're just going to get more scared, and they're going to get more confused. And it's the same thing with mold. And, all of a sudden, everyone had to do all this testing for mold and all this sampling for mold. And now, organizations come out and say, if you can see it, you don't have to sample. And
I think that's exactly right. I think it's, and I'm with you. It's like unnecessary medical testing. It's expensive.
Right.
And it doesn't give, if you don't have good context for the numbers you're looking at, for example, a number of what the levels were before in your home before the fire, then it's incredibly difficult to interpret just those one little snapshot of what's in the air. And as you say, there are many other things in indoor air. And I think, I think it's a little bit like looking online on Google for, symptoms, and one starts to think you've got every form of cancer known to man, and what you've really got is just a headache. And I think that it could take one down a path that's really unnecessary. So I think again, just sitting with where the evidence is, we know about cleaning, and that works. But I don't think the testing generally gives anybody any actionable information that changes the outcome. So I totally agree with you on that. And one thing I wanted to go back to that you asked me a little bit earlier about Arthur Chan's work. and about these heavy metal measurements of arsenic and chromium in northern Canada. And that was really because there was a little bit of a concern about the oil fields in Alberta releasing these compounds. And they found that really that wasn't an impact. I want to draw a difference and make something clear, and that is that there are different kinds of fires. And there are fires that operate just on trees. And then we have these fires that are occurring in the urban system. So at that wildland urban interface where they maybe start in a forest, but they move into houses. And one thing we have been learning, definitely with the LA fires, there was active monitoring going on before the fires ever happened of heavy metals and particulate matter. And what they saw was this huge spike in levels of lead and some other heavy metals, as well as levels of chlorine, in the wildfire, in the smoke in LA. And that made that smoke a little bit different from the smoke from a pure standard wildfire with just forest, because you have all these urban building materials. What they could show was that was adding some extra toxins. So I say this more because it's really hard to take an event that happened in one place and translate that information over to somewhere else. And so I think we're left thinking about best practices. And I think, and so I think it's not to say that just because there wasn't arsenic and chromium in the fires up in the buildings up in Alberta, that's not to say that there isn't going to be lead in some of the wildfire smoke in LA, but more, again, to also not be too concerned about it, because all of these same principles, these cleaning principles, are going to handle all of that toxic material in the same way. It doesn't matter what the identity of those compounds are. You're going to pick up that particulate matter when you do a really good surface clean.
Cliff, I want to make sure you had any final questions or comments.
I guess one final comment is, what we saw happen in the mold industry was that insurance companies, as a reaction to mold claims, ended up either denying it completely or putting these limits on how much they would pay. Like in Pennsylvania, for a while, there's a $5,000 limit. Didn't matter how much mold that you had. That was like, kind of the maximum in Pennsylvania. And what would happen is people, who would have a legitimate mold claim, were kind of talked into spending all this money on sampling and to determine whether they had toxic mold, black, whatever. And the bottom line is they would have been much better off spending that $5,000 on professional cleaning or buying the cleaning equipment and doing it themselves, because in the end, all they had was report with numbers, and, they were confused and alarmed and so on and so forth. And I'm just afraid that, it happened before, and, there are people kind of pushing for it to happen again. Fires, the new mold is gold for certain people, and that's an industry concern. But
yeah, I think you're spot on. I think that's absolutely right. And again, stick with what we know. We know that the cleaning is going to work.
And I guess I would add, it's not that there is never a need for sampling. I mean, there are going to be disagreements, whether there's coverage or not, whether there was actually impact here or not, that you're going to have. But I think it's the routine, the idea of pushing this routine sampling before, during, and after every fire event is where I think maybe we've gone a little too far.
Well, one other thing, Joe, that I just thought about, we were talking about different types of fires, and mostly today we're talking about wildfires, and structure fire. When the fire is in the structure itself, I think that's where we see more impact of interstitial spaces and more pressurization and residues driven and so on and so forth into them than perhaps would occur in wildfires. And I think that if you can clean up the bad ones, if you can clean up a bad structure fire where the fire was in the house, and maybe the car was in the garage, maybe even it was an electric car or whatever, and if those fires can be cleaned up and people can be gotten back into their homes where they're feeling comfortable, and even testing is done and so on and so forth, and kind of prove that everything is in acceptable limits, it can certainly happen in wildfire situations as well. So
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
Dr. Farmer, before we go, anything we missed you'd like to add?
No, I think we've hit the main points, which is that, wildfire smoke can cause all sorts of problems inside buildings. But there are evidence-based solutions and that they are not complicated. And I think it's important to note and really think about the level of exposure your home has had to wildfire smoke. And yeah, if you're next to a structural fire, then that's the case to have that really deep clean. And that's where I would call the professionals who are just talking about doing this kind of really, really strong remediation cleaning. But if you're further downwind, then simple surface cleaning can have a really large effect, and that can be really positive. And I think using those tools are really the way to move forward. And I totally agree with both of you that monitoring and testing, there's a place for it, but only when it's truly needed and it's going to change the outcome and it's going to change what you do. For the most part, I think just sit with where the evidence is, which is cleaning.
And I noticed we had a text from Ed Light, and I think I just continue to try and help get industry and research to work together and figuring out what we need from the researchers, what the researchers can learn and help us with. So I hope you get a chance to chat with Ed and see if maybe there's something you two can do together down the road.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm always happy to talk to people and learn more about what the industry practices are so that we can think about designing our studies to help provide useful information. That's really what we want to do.
And we need more good, useful information. So I look forward to talking to you down the road. Thanks again for joining us, Dr. Delphine Farmer at the University of Colorado State University. I get this right yet. I get a little confused out there in the West. It might be those marijuana laws. I don't know. All right. This is Radio Joe saying thanks to our loyal audience, our sponsors, Grayson, Gone Fish and Fisher at the controls, the Z-Man, Cliff Slotnick, and of course, today's guest, Dr. Delphine Farmer. We'll be back, 2 weeks from now at noon with the next episode of IAQ Radio. Oh, by the way, we'll be coming from Peak and Sigley's event down in Florida there. Cliff, I think you're going down.
Yep, I'll be going down. We'll be reporting on it, I guess, after we get back. Yeah.
If you don't know anything about it, go to my newsletter today, and there's a link to Pete's event. There's also a link to the upcoming EIA, Environmental Information Association conference in Jacksonville, Florida. Check them out. They always bring in a lot of great regulatory people, actually, that help them with putting on that conference and making sure people are aware of all the regulations and guidance for asbestos and lead and all the other things we talk about. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.